Hello, Book 2. It's time for our essay, and I'm reading from one of the books I received today. It's called Peppercorn Papers by Claude A. Prance, and the subtitle is A Miscellany on Books and Book Collecting. It was published in 1964 by the Goldenhead Press of Cambridge, and the chapter/essay I'm going to read is called My Books About Books. So those interested, I would suggest pause and grab a pen and paper. A large piece of paper. Bigger than large, probably a notebook. There'll be a lot of names. He starts out with a quote from Seneca. He has it in the original Latin, but thankfully he does have a translation. It's leisure without books is death, and burial of a man. The essay starts, some damnable heretic once propounded the fallacy that it was a waste of time to read books about books. The heresy is very old, and it has been traced at least back to Montaigne. Calcamus had some nonsense about a big book being a big evil, though he may not have qualified it as the subject, and it has been conjectured that what Solomon really said was, of making books about books, there is no end. The fact remains that Robert Blatchford was right when he said that a man writes books about books because he loved books. He reads books about books for the same excellent reason. I am eternally grateful, therefore, to the owner of a tiny bookshop long since disappeared in Blackfriars Road, Portsmouth, who strongly recommended and persuaded me to buy both John Hill Burton's Book Hunter and P.B.M. Allen's The Book Hunter at Home. It was an octavo cloth-bound edition of Burton, since supplemented but not replaced by the large paper edition with a memoir, portrait, and attractive view of the author's library. How I revelled, and still do, in the sketch of Archdeacon Meadow, who, on the occasion of his visit to London to be examined by a committee of the House of Commons, quote, suddenly disappeared with all his money in his pocket and returned penniless, followed by a wagon containing 372 copies of rare editions of the Bible, end quote. Then there was Fitzpatrick Smart with his private limbo for authors' presentation copies. He was too much a gentleman to sell them, and of too kindly a nature to burn them, so they suffered an entombment decidedly outside the circle of his household gods. The famous picture of Thomas de Quincey under the name of Thomas Papaverius is a gem, but no quotation would do it justice. I have always felt that the first half of Burton's book is more entertaining than the second, but when I read Allen's The Book Hunter at Home, I was enthralled right up to the last few chapters on specialization, which didn't mean much to me in those days. I liked particularly his story of the armchair traveler who systematically went all over the world with the early explorers by means of their books, supplemented by modern maps and charts. Then there was the ambitious Mr. Brown, a student of genealogy, but who was fortunately prevented by his wife from naming his infant son Churchill Brown, after an ancestor, Churchill Le Brun. These two delightful books, of course, whetted my appetite for more, and I soon had Andrew Lang's The Library. What book collector could resist a book with chapters headed An Apology for the Book Hunter, The Library, The Books of the Collector? This led me to the same author's Books and Bookmen, Blades' Enemies of Books, and A.L. Humphrey's The Private Library, and Percy Fitzgerald's The Book Fancier. Two of the best of all were J. Roger Rees's The Diversions of a Bookworm and his The Pleasures of a Bookworm. Here I read of the fascination of association copies of books, of the wonders of some other folks' study, and of many books beloved by bibliophiles. It is curious how the end of the last century and the beginning of this seemed to see the publication of so many of these books about books, which publishers tell me would attract few readers now. The 1920s and 30s were good periods also, for we had the books of A. Edward Newton, Ilo Williams, William Dana Orcutt, Cyril Davenport, Paul Jordan Smith, Sir William Darling, and of course, Holbrook Jackson. How thankful one is for the anatomy of bibliomania. I think that perhaps the publishers may be wrong in their feeling, for I find also on my shelves the delightful writings of Percy Muir, the scholarly works of John Carter, and the enthusiastic books of Lawrence Clark Powell, all published in recent years. A favorite volume, though earlier, is the Autolycus of the Bookstalls, 1902 by Walter Gerald, with chapters on such bookish books as Southey's The Doctor, acquaintance with whom it is at least a source of much entertainment and a liberal education in literature, and on some curbstone libraries, on end pages, autographed copies, pirate books, Booksellers' Row, and a copy of Hood's Plea of the Midsummer Fairies, and a barrow in the New Cut, which yielded a copy of Garrett's The Twilight of the Gods. I find much pleasure in reading of the great book collectors of the past. I have in mind C.I. and M.A. Elton's The Great Book Collectors from 1893, and Seymour de Ricci's English Collectors of Books and Manuscripts, reprinted in 1960. Elton's story of the prodigious memory of the great Antonio Magabici of Florence, who lived in a kind of cave made of piles and masses of books, and died in his 82nd year as happy as a king, has always been a favorite. There is much of interest, too, in W. Roberts' The Book Hunter in London, 1895, with its sketches of old book-selling neighborhoods and of those who frequented them. The book barrows in Farrington Road are still good, and recently yielded me excursions in libraries, being retrospective reviews and bibliographical notes by G.H. Powell. Though new to me, it was published in 1895, and is of the authentic flavor, even if the preface does say that it is intended for the general reader rather than the collector. The author writes of books in his collection and starts with a chapter on the philosophy of rarity, and he has others on a shelf of old storybooks, a medley of memories, with Rabelais at home, and a most exciting chapter, The Pirate's Paradise, which will be appreciated by the young of all ages. Deserving special mention are, I feel, the stories of R.S. Garnett, originally contributed to Blackwood's magazine, but later collected in 2 volumes, Some Book Hunting Adventures, 1931, and Odd Memories, More Book Hunting Adventures, 1932. The author, whose father was superintendent of the reading room of the British Museum, was brought up in an atmosphere of books, and although he turned to the law as a profession, he received enormous pleasure in collecting books in his spare time. He came in contact with many well-known and amusing figures, and many of them appear in his books. The stories of book finds in some of these collectors' memoirs call to mind the class of books described as book collecting fiction. Among the best of these I should place The Intimate Thoughts of John Baxter, bookseller, 1942, by Augustus Muir, The Unpublishable Memoirs, 1924, by A.S.W. Rosenbach, The Love Affairs of a Bibliomaniac, 1896, by Edward Field, and a play Nathaniel Badley Bookman, 1924, by Dorothy Una Radcliffe. The Private Papers of a Bankrupt Bookseller by Sir William Darling deserves special attention and is frequently dipped into. While of stories about bookshops, there is Christopher Morley's Parnassus on Wheels and The Haunted Bookshop. E.V. Lucas's most attractive over Bemerton's, with its stories of Dr. Giles's Chinese Bibliographical Dictionary and of Aubrey's Brief Lives and Flaubert's Bibliomania, reprinted in 1954, but which I first read of in Lang's The Library, although not quite of this type, but with decidedly bookish atmosphere, are some of the stories of M.R. James, and more recently, the fascinating volume of short stories, The Alabaster Hand and Other Ghost Stories, 1949, by A.N.L. Munby, librarian of King's College. Worthy of mention, too, are books such as J. Penn's For Readers Only, amusing studies of readers in the British Museum reading room, and certain chapters in books, for example, R.W. Chapman's first essay in Portrait of a Scholar, with its unforgettable sketch of Ingram Bywater and Edmund Blunden's Bringing Them Home, originally printed in the first number of the Book Collectors Quarterly. For sheer attractiveness of title, it would be difficult to surpass Basil Alderton's Fragments Among Old Volumes, 1910. But books about books are not all memoirs of book collectors and book collecting fiction. Fascinating as they can be, for the collector has just as much pleasure in reading and, of course, possessing books on bibliography and librarianship, including those on bookbinding, typography, and printing bookplates. Bookselling, and publishing, and the very large class of purely critical works, which are rather outside the scope of this essay. Of bibliography, I find on my shelves one of the best of all books on the subject, R.B. McCarro's An Introduction to Bibliography for Literary Students, now reissued, a volume to go back to again and again. Interesting and useful also are Arundel Adale's A Student's Manual of Bibliography and his Sources of English Literature, while other books which are still valuable are those of James Duff Brown, H.B. Wheatley, J.H. Slater, John Power, and Charles D. Jacobi. Of bibliographies of particular authors, these, of course, are acquired according to one's interest, and those that I have found useful for my own collections are J.C. Thompson's Bibliography of the Writings of Charles and Mary Lamb, 1908, Robert Eckhart's Edward Thomas, 1937, and Edward A. Martin's Bibliography of Gilbert Wright, 1934. Lonz's manual is still found to have material not available elsewhere, and the most valued possession is the Cambridge Bibliography of English Literature with its supplementary volume. Closely followed by bibliography in interest, I find the many books on libraries and librarianship, such as Easdale's The British Museum, 1946. One of the best is J. Willis's Clark's The Care for Books. The author calls his big book an essay on the development of libraries and other fittings to the end of the 18th century, but he does this to indicate that it is merely an attempt to deal in a summary fashion with an extremely wide and interesting subject. The main illustrations in the volume are a source of delight to anyone fascinated, as I am, by medieval libraries. A more recent book which I have enjoyed is The English Library Before 1700, edited by Francis Warmold and C.E. Wright, and published in 1958. Then there are the interesting volumes on bookselling and publishing from Charles Knight's Shadows of the Old Booksellers, Curwen's History, and Marston's Sketches, to F.A. Munby's Valuable Publishing and Bookselling, and the many volumes telling the stories of particular booksellers and publishing houses such as those of Grant Richards and J.M. Dent. Some cover the work of private presses, and two which I have enjoyed are C.W. Beaumont's The First Score, 1927, and Thomas Jones's The Greg-Nog Press, 1954. Most collectors will find books on bookbinding interesting. Many collectors will find books on bookbinding interesting, if only as an aid to understanding certain aspects of bibliography. One of the best is Douglas Cockrell's Bookbinding and the Care of Books, while the more recent book, A History of English Craft Bookbinding Technique by Bernard C. Middleton, is invaluable and fills a long-felt need. Equally fascinating are books on printing, such as Oliver Simon's Introduction to Typography, Staniel Morrison's 4 Centuries of Fine Printing, reprinted in 1949, and S.H. Steinberg's 500 Years of Printing, 1955. Essential reading is, of course, that done in catalogs, and while most have to be discarded, a few treasured examples are hoarded, as are odd volumes of book prices current. Foremost among my catalogs is the sumptuous production in 3 volumes of the library of A. Edward Newton. Others of particular interest include the First Edition Club Exhibition Catalog, 1922, Elkin Matthews' English Literature in the Early 19th Century, 1930, and an introduction by Blunden, the Catalogue of an Exhibition arranged to illustrate new paths in book collecting, 1934, the National Book League English Poetry Catalogue, 1947, and a Catalogue of the Strawberry Hill Sale of 1842. Periodicals devoted to book collecting have flourished from time to time, usually for relatively short periods. They often turn up as odd volumes in the barrows, and among those I have acquired and enjoyed are The Bibliographer, Book Lore, and The Bookworm, all published in the 1880s by Elliot Stock, who produced so many books about books. Then there is The Bibliophile, 1908, and a gap in my collection until the famous Book Collectors Quarterly of the 1930s. Today, one is grateful for the book collector and, of course, the private library. Finally, what books there are to praise of books. From Philibon and the Book Lovers and Crition, Andrew Lang's Ballads of Books, and Gleason White's Book Song, essays by Charles Lamb, Robert Southey, Leigh Hunt, Alexander Smith, Austin Dobson, Augustine Burrow, and countless others. One of my favorites is Edmund Goss's introduction to his Gossip in the Library, 1891. He writes of a late book collector who, being anxious to fly all outward noise, to build himself a library in his garden. As Goss says, the phrase seems to contain the whole felicity of man, a library in the garden. It sounds like having a castle in Spain or a sheep walk in Arcadia. So there ends. A lot of titles there. There's many that I know and many that I don't know. Some I have. So I'll be making a list myself of these and looking into some and possibly even ordering a few. This is, you can see the book is just warping the board, so I'm going to have to put this under some heavy weight before it goes back and touches itself. No, I won't do that, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed that BookTube. I will see you later. Bye.